Allow me to confess right off the top here that I'm a bit nervous about this week's episode, not because of the subject matter or because, I don't know, my junior high school math teacher is listening, but because you think you know a program, you work with a program for years, and then all at once it starts acting up, and you reboot because that's what everyone tells you to do first. Reboot the computer. Something's gone wrong somewhere. You learn from all the millions of times you've watched Star Wars that maybe there's some carbon scoring in there interfering with it playing the hologram from General Kenobi. But no, my DAW, as we say in the industry, my digital audio workstation, as if I feel part of an industry community, my recorder, for want of a better word. When I was doing this week's reissue episode, I got through 98% of it, no problem. And then at the end, I was papering over the old Twitter addresses and so on, and I was just about to say, well, thank you very much for listening. I'll see you this week with episode 343, as roughly I've been saying with most of the reissue episodes, and it just kept crashing. And when I brought it back and tried to reopen the folder, it killed my whole computer, froze everything dead, over and over and over. You cannot imagine my level of frustration. And in the end, I somehow got it open, and no matter what I did, it would not let me finish the show. If I eliminated the part where I tried to finish it, I could still mix down the episode and put it up, as I eventually did, because discretion was the better part of valor at that point, or I'd still be there. And the aspect of it that really vexes me, beyond the fact that by the time I'm done with one of these shows, I'm done, I'm spent, I need to finish and get the thing out to you. But beyond that, it was nothing that I haven't done now with the Infinite Inning over 360 times. I know on a prior episode, I've told you about the Battle of Jutland. It has nothing to do with baseball. It was between the British and the Germans, two nationalities which largely do not play baseball. But I told the story anyway because it's a good story. And famously, when these two fleets did battle in a major way for basically the only time in the First World War, these ships were way too expensive to risk. So you just kept them home and admired them. But in this battle, the British rapidly found out that their ships had a design flaw. Are you ready for my second Star Wars reference of the show? They had an unshielded exhaust port, essentially, except the port was actually from the deck to the magazine, and if a spark happened to land on the deck, and battles do tend to produce sparks and other fiery, flaming objects, if it went down a shaft, essentially, from the deck to where all the ammunition was kept, the ship popped like a balloon, a fiery balloon filled with shrapnel and unfortunately containing, well, the crew. So the two fleets sally forth, they meet in the North Sea, they exchange fire, and British ships just start blowing up. And one of the two guys in charge on the British side, I don't remember if it was Beatty or Jellicoe, I think it was Beatty, turned to someone and said, "There seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today." Now, of course, I bring that up as an analogy for my recording situation here, doing something totally unprecedented and unexpected. At the same time, you can never think of the Battle of Jutland too often because it's just a great example of things not going the way that they're supposed to, the way that they're planned, the unexpected happening. If you're like me and this sort of trivia is stuck in your head pretty much 24/7, then it comes to mind, roughly once a week, somewhere in a baseball season, because you will be watching a given game and perhaps the home team is up 6-1 in the 7th inning. And so they bring in a reliever, and that normally reliable reliever cannot get anybody out. So the manager trudges out to the mound and calls on someone even more reliable who also can't get any outs. By now it's 6-4. Manager, by now wearing out a path between the dugout and the mound, calls on the closer, and the closer walks the bases loaded. I watched Edwin Diaz do something very similar just tonight, although he ended up getting away with it. And as all of this is happening, all of this unexpected failure, I imagine that the manager is thinking, "I say, there seems to be something wrong with our bloody bullpen today." And he probably is, just not in those words. Anyway, to use what I expect is an archaic expression, one that I learned from Gilbert and Sullivan, I am all at 6s and 7s with this episode because with practically every word that I say, I expect the digital axe to fall. And since, again, I am not working off of notes primarily, when something's gone, it's gone. I can't really recreate the moment. We talk a lot in our society nowadays about AI, and I do find aspects of it disturbing and upsetting. My work, my Casey Stengel book in particular, is among the works that some of these companies have hoovered up without compensation to train their machines. And if you've ever written a book, then you know that, oh Lord, do you deserve compensation for any use of that material because you sweated it. So I'm definitely opposed to aspects of AI which repurpose other people's work, and I'm certainly opposed to people who use it to write things that they're not capable of writing, or to avoid learning how, or to create art that they're not capable of drawing or painting, or again, avoiding doing the hard work of learning how. And it is a lot of hard work. And it may never pay off, which is just another way of saying find what you are suited for. Don't just hand it off to R2-D2, third Star Wars reference, to do the work for you. Because again, then you're a free rider. And you don't know, and in fact are incapable of, the things you're presenting yourself as capable of doing. But I do find AI useful in the sense that you can do a more sophisticated search with it. And what I mean by that is when I do my reading for this show or for other projects, I may not remember everything perfectly, particularly here in my old age. And this came up just today, actually. I was talking to a friend about the French Resistance, as one does. It's something that I've been thinking about lately, and I'm actually going to bring up in passing an aspect of what I've been thinking about later in the program. One night last week, I read small parts of about a half dozen different books and took some notes, but I didn't take, as it turns out, perfect notes for this conversation with a friend that I didn't know I was going to have. I wanted to mention to him one minor figure in this much larger story, but I couldn't remember his name. So I reached for the book that I thought I had seen it in, but it turned out not to be there. And after repeating the process several times in failure and being in danger of blowing an actual deadline that I had to be working on, I turned to Google's AI, which hilariously usually just turns to Google itself. So maybe having this between you and the search is actually an inefficiency. But in any case, I said, there's a guy involved with the French Resistance. I believe he was at this fight and he did this thing. Can you remind me of the name? And it did, instantly. And maybe I should still feel bad about using it that way. I'm not sure. It doesn't seem too different to me from a regular search. But the reason I bring this up is how often have you done a regular search on the subject of why is this program acting this way? Or why is my computer behaving this way? And the answers are all over the place and generally not useful. And it would be handy if one thing that AI could do is give you a little bit more of an intuitive, interactive tool for diagnostics. I mean, some of you are computer savvy, far more computer savvy than me. I don't feel like I'm totally ignorant, but I'm certainly not a mechanic or a programmer. So it would be good to be able to say, hey, why is my computer being an asshole right now? And get a useful answer back. R2, can you look, fourth Star Wars reference, it's not even on my mind today. R2, can you look under the hood of my digital audio workstation and tell me why it won't let me finish the episode? Because right now, the alternative, as far as I know, is a regular flavor Google search, which is spectacularly unlikely to be successful, and most often will direct you to Reddit and some group that may or may not have discussed it 5 or 10 years ago and a previous iteration of your program to which the answer no longer applies. Nothing against Reddit, there are some aspects of it I kind of like. When I have insomnia, which is a fairly regular occurrence in my life, Reddit can be my friend. So enough of the old boy complaining. Just know that if this episode ends up being about 11 minutes long, it's because the master controller decided that I'd had enough, put me on the game grid, and ended the show. You'll know that it's taken over when I start to fade, drifting down and away into the digital haze, down and away, going, gone, and after all is silence. Just kidding, although possibly not. So one quick baseball story, very quick, before we continue our journey together. I thought about making this a long discussion of crime and punishment, but it really doesn't deserve this. There's a line from the foundational umpire, Bill Clem, that's in almost every book of baseball quotations. I'm going to hit you with a totally unrelated line later from a different guy, a sports writer, which also shows up not just in books of baseball quotations, but in books of great insults. I wouldn't say that it is. I wouldn't say that it's like at the level of Oscar Wilde, but perhaps I'm jaded. The Clem story, such as it is that a player threw his bat in the air while protesting a called strike. It is sometimes said to be the catcher Al Lopez. In response to this, Clem supposedly said, "Young man, if that bat comes down, you're out of the game." I happened to be looking at that line unintentionally. It was just thrust upon me. And for the first time, I really thought about it and thought, that's impossible. First of all, by now we've all seen a lot of bat tosses. They don't go that high in the air. And back then, bats were heavy. Guys were using 40-ounce bats. That's a pretty good heave. If on the off chance it was one of Buzz Arlett's bats or Babe Ruth in a strange year, that sucker might have been 50 ounces. To get it up that high, you'd have to wait for a friend to come assist you, or maybe run up to the second deck and drop it and then pretend you'd thrown it up. Maybe I have that backwards. Maybe you position someone in the upper deck, you throw it upwards, they catch it, and they throw it up to the next guy, and it's kind of a relay. 20 feet is 3 Aaron Judges standing on each other's shoulders with nearly enough inches left over for the one at the top to hold up a Kenner Early Bird Special first edition Han Solo action figure, which was very undersized compared to the rest of the action figure line. And yes, that was yet another Star Wars reference. You have my sincere, contrite apologies. And then here's another thing. What planet are we even on in this story? Gravity is not so slow to act on a falling baseball bat, even with an apogee of 20 feet. I'm sure you can work this out mathematically if you know anything about physics. It's not going to be up there long enough for Bill Clem to speak a 12-word sentence, even if he really rushes it. "Young man, if the bat comes down, you're out of the game." What was that, Bill? Oh, never mind. Al Lopez had a really long career between catching more games than any player had ever caught to that point in history, and then having a long Hall of Fame career as a manager. Similarly, Bill Clem had a long career. He essentially started in Constantinople umpiring at the Hippodrome and lasted until 1941. Having said that, their careers only overlapped so much, such that Clem only ran Lopez twice, once in 1931, once in 1935, both times when Lopez's Dodgers visited the Braves. On both occasions, Lopez was on defense and was arguing balls and strikes thrown by his own pitcher. So it seems unlikely he would have heaved a bat unless he grabbed the bat of the player at the plate, who might have grabbed it back and a tug of war ensued, which Lopez then won, or perhaps grabbed it and ran away and then threw it 20 feet in the air. In the 1935 case, it was Wally Berger's bat. I don't know how heavy Wally Berger's bat was. Let's say 36 ounces. How many foot-pounds of force does it take to throw a 36-ounce bat 20 feet in the air? And then we apply the gravitational constant. Let me just get out my calculator here. I might have missed something, but according to RetroSheet, actually the only time that Bill Clem ejected a player for throwing a bat happened on August 5th, 1910. When he tossed, pardon the expression, Jimmy Sheckard, the Cubs great. And I didn't look up the game stories for that because it seemed fruitless, and also because I don't have a strong reason to believe that gravity was dramatically different in 1910 than it was 25 years later in 1935, and I still don't think you can get out a 12-word sentence like that before the bat would fall down. Now, I did check both of the Al Lopez ejections, and there's nothing about bat heaving in there, but I will say that he earned the latter one, the one with Wally Berger at the plate, and as Lopez told or confessed the story, he had been complaining about Clem's calls, and finally Clem said, "That will be enough out of you, young man." And so Lopez stopped, but Clem didn't. He just went right on warning him. And Lopez got sick of it and finally said, "You know, if you don't shut up, you'll miss some more calls." Well, that brought out the thumb. Alas, they're both gone now, but both reside in the Hall of Fame, so I'm sure they occasionally have a good laugh about it in whatever Valhalla they now share. You know who's not invited to those conversations? Jimmy Sheckard. who's still out there in some blasted gray landscape, tossing bats in the air over and over again and trying to get them to stay up there long enough for him to recite a long passage of Shakespeare, sometimes while drinking a glass of water. And the more he tosses the bat of Tantalus, the heavier it gets and the faster it falls. That's what happens when you abuse a guy like Bill Clem, I guess. And what do you call that act? Well, we call it the infinite inning. Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show, Infinite Inning number 343. I am and remain your convivial host for this journey to the past on a mission to better understand the present, and they call me Stephen Goldman. Sometimes when I go to doctor's offices, which I do all too often, and they say, "Name please," at the front desk, I say, "They call me Stephen Goldman." Sometimes they even laugh. Maybe next time I'll say, "Strangers call me Stephen Goldman, but my friends call me Sparky." I'm reaching the he's embarrassing stage of life. I realize that. I have a very good friend, and unfortunately I haven't spoken to him for a number of years for various reasons. He remains a beloved friend nevertheless, but he was a bit older than me and also had a practiced eccentricity that was probably about 75% performative. And he'd often invite me out to lunch or dinner, and no matter where we went, whether it was McDonald's or a 5-star Michelin star restaurant, he'd say, "What's good here?" when the waiter or waitress came over. And he did it so consistently, so persistently, that it was just something you sort of had to get through. And yet it wasn't embarrassing. I found it endearing somehow because he was so committed to doing it. And it was always good-natured. Like, I've been to restaurants with people who are on some fundamental level angry, and you would spend the entire meal nervous that a spoon would drop because they were going to go off on somebody. I feel like this is a universal enough thing that you might have had someone like this in your life. And for me, at one point, many years ago, that person actually turned to me and said, "Have you been quietly hyperventilating throughout this entire meal?" It was roughly at that moment that I realized I needed to stop putting myself in that situation. I hope as we embark on episode 343 that you are well, and if you're not, please let me know. Very briefly, before we move on, this week at Baseball Prospectus, I wrote a column which makes reference to the infinite inning because the subject of communicable disease has come up so often here. We've talked about Christy Mathewson. We've talked about Bill Delancey. I made Bill Delancey the reissue episode this week because of that column, because he suffered so badly from tuberculosis. And this was inspired, of course, by current events, which is that the state of Florida is going to supposedly end vaccine mandates in the state. And the old and the young in particular are going to suffer very badly for that. And it is really in the name of superstition or primitivism rowing us backwards to a time before Christy Mathewson was a baby. That is when the communicability of some of these illnesses truly became understood. From 1882 on, no excuses. And yet, there are some people who still don't get it, or they have a weirdly eugenical point of view, which is to say that a virus or a bacteria is a test. And if you fail that test, you did not deserve to survive or pass on your genes, which doesn't explain anything, again, about the kid who's too young to pass on his genes, but simply has an immature immune system, or the older person who has given their genes. They're done with that. They're just enjoying the ride down, and they don't deserve to have it truncated because someone didn't get a measles shot. Today's second act concerns a now obscure first baseman who is actually a very good hitter and was similarly inspired by, well, some of the same current events and some of the same people. This is not in the medical department, but in another area. You might see this story as being symptomatic, pardon the expression, of a kind of hysteria. I'm not sure that it is. I leave it up to you. And so it is time to break for a quick recess, or recess for a quick break. And on the other side, we will journey to the depths of World War II. But things were starting to turn around at exactly the time that our story begins. So keep the faith and keep them flying until we get back, okay? This conversation we're about to have involves, as I said, an obscure first baseman. Obscure, although he had some big seasons in pinstripes. Sometimes being a Yankee doesn't prevent you from being forgotten. It's inspired, as I said before the break, by the timely and currently political. It begins with remembering a guy that neither I nor, I presume, anyone listening ever saw. Yankees number 5 for a few years, Nick Etten. Yes, that was Joe DiMaggio's number, but he was in the Army at the time, and the Yankees weren't precious about those things back then. Etten was part of the long struggle the Yankees had to find a regular first baseman after the sudden end of Lou Gehrig's career. Following Babe Dahlgren, who just happened to have been on the premises at the time, they tried second baseman Joe Gordon because he had a prospect, in theory, chasing him off of the Keystone, but that hurt them more than it helped, and they unwound the move. That rung in the brief Johnny Sturm era. Sturm was turned to again in desperation. He had one good month in his whole career, which lasted just through the 1941 season. It wasn't just that he hit about as poorly as any first baseman has in Yankees history over a full season, but that the war came along and took him away. Next, in a move that was half a favor between the Yankees farm director and the manager of the Braves, George Weiss and Casey Stengel respectively, and half a response to actual need, the Yankees sent an outfield prospect, Tommy Holmes, a singles hitter who in peacetime would have been blocked by the great Yankees outfield of Charlie Keller, Joe DiMaggio, and Tommy Henrich, and in return, they picked up a veteran first baseman who had once been a prospect of theirs, but who had been blocked by the Iron Horse. His name was Buddy Hassett, and Hassett, in his own way, is as useful to remember as the Battle of Jutland, because he's kind of an archetype. He was the rare 300 hitter who couldn't hit. Sometimes I worry that this also describes current Padres first baseman Luis Arraez. Now, Hassett was a good fielder, but he rarely walked and rarely hit home runs. Now, a first baseman who can scoop throws and hit a soft 310 is better than having nothing at all, and that kind of describes Johnny Sturm, but the years that Hassett hit 285 or 295 were not that valuable. In 1942, he hit 284 with a 325 on-base percentage, a 364 slugging percentage, 5 home runs, 32 walks. That was his age 30 season. And it ended in a pathetic way. Actually, it started in a pathetic way. The Yankees gave the opening day job to a rookie named Ed Levy, who they thought or hoped was Jewish. He wasn't, and also he couldn't hit. He went 5 for 41 over the first 13 games. Joe McCarthy, the manager, and Ed Barrow, the general manager, were done with him forever, and that was how Hassett got his job back. Now, the Yankees won the AL pennant in 1942 and played an absolutely loaded Cardinals team in the World Series. The Cardinals had a lot of young players, were crazy deep, and as yet hadn't been too affected by the war. Being a relatively light hitter for a first baseman, Hassett was asked to sacrifice a lot more than you would expect of a post-deadball first baseman. He led the Yankees that year in sacrifices with 11, edging shortstop Phil Rizzuto and pitcher Tiny Bonham, each of whom had 10. Game 3 of the World Series, bottom of the first inning, Rizzuto leads off and bunts down the third baseline for a hit. Manager McCarthy puts on the bunt sign, and as so often happens, Hassett got his thumb in the way of a pitch, or vice versa, and that was it for him in the World Series, and as it turned out, the rest of his major league career, because he enlisted in the Navy and was gone for 3 years. He didn't only play ball in the service, by the way. He served on a carrier that saw action in the Pacific. And so the Yankees once again needed a first baseman. In January 1943, as the Battle of Stalingrad was grinding thousands to death, but crucially ending on a positive note for overall humanity, the Phillies, in one of the final deals to be orchestrated by outgoing owners or soon-to-be outgoing owners Jerry and May Nugent, and how often have we talked about them on the program, sent first baseman Nick Etten to New York in return for Levy, Al Gettle, and $10,000. I should have said Al Gettle is a pitcher, reported as $15,000 at the time. The Yankees get their first baseman, commented the New York Herald Tribune, without giving up anyone they wanted to keep. Etten was the 8th first baseman AL after Lou, or PH, post-Horse. After the Phillies were sold, the trade was half unwound. We'll get back to this in a moment. Levy and Gettle were returned to sender after the new owner, Bill Cox, claimed they had never been delivered. Maybe they were holding out. Maybe they just didn't want to be Phillies. In March, the Yankees sent 2 different players to resolve the dispute, extremely veteran catcher Tom Padden and pitching prospect Al Gerhauser in their places. That's Al Gerhauser, not Alger Hauser, and not Alger Hiss, who was about to go to Yalta. Cox tried to get Etten back too. The commissioner said, I imagine the Nugents kept the $10,000. Etten's comment on going from the Phillies to the Yankees, Christmas comes early this year. I mean, it was January. That's pretty early for Christmas. The trade was made on January 22nd. By coincidence, that is a date that has been on my mind a bit. As I said, I've been reading up on a certain period in history, and these things are totally unrelated, but I can't help making these connections when I see them. That Nick Etten was acquired by the Yankees on January 22nd, and January 22nd also happens to be the day that the Nazis began a major roundup and deportation of Jews from the city of Marseille in the south of France, which was a very important city because after the Germans invaded, that was about as far as a refugee could go and still be in France and yet be far away, in theory, from the Germans. Getting out of France was nigh impossible, particularly when governments like Portugal and the United States, which had people still in France, whether as part of private organizations devoted to refugees or the consulates, were giving people exit visas, and their government said, no, stop it, we don't want those people. And besides, you might upset that nice Mr. Hitler, and they actually pulled those diplomats out and sometimes punished them. By deportation, I mean that they were sent to Auschwitz and, well, you know the rest. It's weakly ironic that Ed Levy was included in the Etten trade that same day, but that doesn't work even as a weak irony. First, because who cares? It's irrelevant. And second, he wasn't even Jewish. He just had a Jewish surname. It was his stepfather's name. His birth name was Whitner. I don't mean to bring these things up. Like I said, I just can't escape it. Etten, of German heritage actually, was from Chicago, and he had been a very good amateur athlete, a good enough athlete to get a scholarship to play at Villanova. He had been Pirates property when he was still a teen, but he never got a chance to play. He could always hit, but he was an outfielder then, and he was bad at it because he had below average speed. He was finally convinced to shift to first base. He never became Keith Hernandez. He was a below average first baseman too. He first came up with the A's after hitting .370 with a .472 on base and a .518 slugging percentage with Savannah of the Sally League. He got a cup of coffee then. In 1939, he was the Athletics' opening day first baseman, but didn't hit and was sent down to Baltimore of the International League in June. He hit .299, .386, .490 in 105 games there, with 14 home runs and a bunch of walks. That's who he was at his best, exactly that season. When I look at his stats, he reminds me of the musical question, what if Nick Johnson had been healthy for a few seasons? Indeed, if you scroll down on Etten's baseball reference page and peruse his similarity scores, Etten turns up as his 4th most comparable player. His number 1 is Yuli Gurriel, which strikes me as totally wrong. Johnson is much closer. Etten spent all of 1940 with Baltimore, despite being sent back to the A's by Judge Landis for having been optioned too many times. He stayed on, hit well, and subsequently was peddled to the Phillies. He was 27, and he was finally going to get a real chance to play. And he killed it, hitting .311 with a .405 on-base percentage and a .454 slugging percentage. This is not in the Baker Bowl. This is in Shibe Park, a real stadium. He hit 14 home runs. He drew 82 walks. That computed to a 147 OPS plus, and that should have established him. But in Phillies year 2, he got slumpy, dropping to 264, 357, 375 with only 8 home runs. Now, it wasn't good, but it also wasn't as bad as it looked. Between seasons, the National League dropped from 4.2 runs per game to 3.9, and the league OPS declined from 688 to 681. 8 qualified hitters averaged 300 or more with, and we just talked about this last week, Ernie Lombardi winning the title at 330, albeit with relatively few at-bats. In 1941, 13 National League hitters had averaged 300 or more, with Pete Reiser winning the batting title at 343. Offense was just down. A further complication for Etten was, as I said a moment ago, he was in no way Doug Mankiewicz. Minky is another player who shows up among his comps and probably shouldn't, and his league-leading 19 errors at first base, Etten's, not Mankiewicz's, looked worse when they weren't compensated for with a bunch of runs. As with so many players, his best position was probably DH, but of course that didn't exist then. One of the best lines about him, which came later, was spoken by long-time New York Daily News Yankees beat writer Joe Trimble, and this is the one I referred to earlier as being not just in baseball books, but books about insults. Watching a play in which Etten dove for a ball and his glove came off his hand, but somehow the ball went into the glove anyway, Trimble said, "Nick Etten's glove feels better with Nick Etten out of it." Another time, when Etten signed for a salary like $18,500, Trimble wrote, "The 500 is for his fielding." And so Etten became a target for a familiar organization, the BFOP, the booing fans of Philadelphia. Also, the Yankees were offering the Phillies cash money, and thus the Nugents were happy to get rid of him. They had no choice, really. The National League was pressuring them to sell out or just give up, and selling Etten was part of their raising enough money to keep the team. Here's how bad things were for the Phillies at that time. As of the last day of January, to date, the club has not re-signed Hans Lobert as manager, although Jerry Nugent said no one else is being considered. It has not selected a definite training site and has mailed no contracts to players. They were out of business. 9 days later, the National League owners teamed up to buy out the club from under them. As for the Yankees, well, they knew that Etten had 3 dependents and thought he wasn't likely to be called up. And he wasn't, but they were wrong about the possibility because they had to worry about it a lot. Each spring training, will the government let Nick Etten come to camp? We won't know until he gets here. If I could just jump ahead for a moment to the post-war years. In 1948, when Etten was 34 and had just left the major leagues the year before, he played for the Oakland Oaks, champions of the Pacific Coast League. This team was referred to as the 9 Old Men. He was one of the 9, which both invoked the recalcitrant Supreme Court inherited by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933. That's how the press referred to them, as the 9 Old Men, but also the fact that the Oaks lineup was all veterans except for the 20-year-old Billy Martin. And yeah, it was a Casey Stengel team, but we won't dwell on that at this time. Etten played 164 games that year and hit .313 with 43 home runs. The guy could really hit. He just really couldn't do it consistently. Here's what the Yankees got. I wouldn't say Bizarro number 5 was an all-time Yankees great at first base, but for 3 years, he was pretty good given the wartime manpower shortage. He was more of a lefty line drive hitter than a fly ball hitter, so he wasn't launching balls over the short porch and right with any regularity, but he did well enough under the conditions. In 1943, he played every day and hit .271 with a .355 on base and a .420 slugging percentage, including 35 doubles, 14 home runs, 76 walks, and 107 runs batted in. His averages worked out to a 125 OPS plus. You know how many times in 7 years with the Yankees, Tino Martinez had a 125 OPS plus? I'll grant you twice. In 1997, when he hit 44 home runs, he was at 143, and the next year, 1998, he was at 124, so close enough. He was also a better glove than Etten was. I'm not trying to denigrate old Constantino so much as to establish a point of comparison. His Yankees average was 113. In 1944, the year that war requirements led to about half a season of a dead baseball, Nick hit .293, .399, .466, with a league-leading 22 home runs, and also led the league with 97 walks. That was a 144 OPS plus, if you're keeping track at home. Finally, well, sort of finally, in 1945, when the war was finally dragging to a bloody close, he hit .287, .387, .437, with 18 home runs and a league-leading 111 RBIs. So, in total, for those 3 seasons, if I may recite just a few more numbers, I know how much you love it. He hit .283, .381, .441 in 460 games, averaging a 135 OPS plus, or about 3.7 wins above replacement per season. On the downside, he got into just one World Series in 1943, and although the Yankees won, he went only 2 for 19 with a walk. And then, alas, we also must discuss 1946. The boys came back, hooray, that was good, and the teams were obligated by law to give them all a shot. In spring training, the Yankees pitted Etten against Sturm and Hassett, ghosts of a war just past, and a former prospect, Steve Bud Sushak, who was already 27, but he had more than earned his shot. He had left the minors after his age 23 season, he went into the Army, he served 3 years, and he saw a ton of combat as part of the liberation of Europe and the defeat of fascism. Thank you, Steve, wherever you are. All 3 wore Uncle Sam's uniform, but before they went into the service, they had moved up to the majors almost entirely on fielding skill, wrote the New York Star-Ledger earlier in the 1946 season. Sturm and Hassett are much better fielders than Nick Etten of the Yanks will ever be. They have class and speed around the initial sack, but the Yankees prefer to keep Etten. He's a distance clouder, which makes up for his deficiencies at first in the view of the Yank operators. The third player the Ledger was referring to was not, I believe, in camp with them at that time. That was Johnny McCarthy, who had played with the Dodgers, Giants, and Braves, wasn't very much of a hitter, but was thought to be a good fielder. He was magical out there with the glove, said the Ledger, but something more was demanded, something which he lacks. Well, Etten won the job, but he couldn't keep it. Let's take one last quick break for this episode, and we'll come back to wrap the Nick Etten story, including the why of it. Why is this relevant now? Well, not to put it too simply, but Etten didn't hit. It was a season of a lot of turmoil for the Yankees. Larry McPhail was back from the war too and had taken over as the owner's front man and was moving players in and out, and also drove McCarthy out of town. After roughly 15 years in the job, he just couldn't stand the stress of dealing with the guy and basically had a breakdown. And starting around mid-season roughly, Etten started sitting for Sushak, who was actually great in a small sample, although his real on-field glory days would come from 1951 to 53 with the Tigers, when he hit .268, .315, .492 in a part-time role for them. He had a lot of physical problems and really couldn't play every day, but in those years he did make the most of it when he did get onto the field. Tommy Henrich, normally a right fielder, also got some chances. He was a very good hitter, obviously, and he hit quite well while playing first. In fact, that one year, better than he did while playing the outfield. The following spring, the Yankees sold Etten back to the Phillies, who once again took him back to the return window, but he never did play for the Yankees again. They had acquired a long-ago prospect who had been blocked by Gehrig, George McQuinn, a 5-time All-Star. He was something of an Etten-style hitter, but with a much better glove, and they were fine with that for about a year and a half. They sent Etten to Newark and then eventually moved him to Oakland, and that Stengel team that I mentioned, they had a relationship with the owner of the Oaks, even though the Pacific Coast League was independent. That's how Stengel got there. That's how Etten got there too. These were all manipulations or machinations. I don't mean to make them sound sinister. This was the invisible, or rather visible, hand of Yankees farm director and future general manager George Weiss. He was just taking care of people and players that were in his orbit. And that's what he did, George Weiss, for Casey and Etten. So the reason I was thinking about this today is that this afternoon, September 5th, as I speak to you, the administration's foot soldiers in its war against human beings who happen not to have been born here, ICE, raided a battery plant near Savannah, Georgia, co-owned by Hyundai and LG, and they arrested 475 people who were or are South Korean citizens. No one has claimed that I'm aware of that they were part of a fentanyl smuggling ring or were part of the Trinidad de Agua gang. Stephen Schrank, a special agent in charge of Homeland Security investigations for Georgia, said the raid was intended to ensure, I quote, a level playing field for businesses that comply with the law. They do seem to have grabbed a couple of South Korean nationals who are here on business visas doing, meetings. It seems to me that we've been going around the world insisting that businesses build here, and in this case, they did. They're still working on this battery plant, which is part of an $8 billion development in the state of Georgia. If you've ever been involved with technological industrial developments like this, and I personally have not, but I'm close to people who have, you want it to be set up precisely to your specifications or your batteries won't work. Batteries are extremely finicky things, as everyone who has, accidentally burned down their house because they bought an e-bike with a cheap lithium-ion battery can tell you. I can't say for sure that these companies were not trying to cheat the United States in some way, but at a distance, it seems far more likely to me that they were trying to get their factory up in the way that they needed it to, and then the bulk of the jobs would go to Americans. Now, even if they did break the rules, and I'm sure they did in some sense, as people who are trying to do business with us, it would have been very simple for the same authorities, rather than coming in with guns and handcuffs, to transmit a message to the people in charge saying, you're breaking the rules. Anyone who shouldn't be here, get them out. They have a week to get to the airport. Sayonara, so long, farewell, goodbye. Problem solved, fewer hard feelings, fewer people hurt or frightened, no expense to the taxpayers. But it's not about the law. It's not about the rules. It's about power and intimidation and xenophobia. These are Asians, not white Americans, and that's as much justification as these people need to start throwing their weight around. And so I started to wonder what baseball would look like after some hypothetical future day when they felt even more empowered and these same people in authority started telling baseball teams that they could no longer employ people who weren't born here. Every team would lose key players, and some of the game's biggest stars would be gone. What would baseball look like then? And it would look a lot like Nick Etton's World of Baseball. In preparing this episode, I noticed an article in an old Liberty magazine by NBC sports guy Bill Stern. I mentioned him last week in that he hosted a fairly useless radio show. The article was titled, Who's Who in Baseball 44, and the subhead read, Who's the next batter? Brother, you'll have to ask the draft board. Here's a preview of the dizziest of all big league baseball seasons. So let's go back to that year's Yankees, when Etton was one of their best players. No DiMaggio, no Keller, no Henrik. Instead, you had Johnny Lindell, a converted pitcher who, it turned out, could hit. It also turned out he could drink, so his career didn't last that long. Bud Matheny and former Phillies one-time All-Star Hirsch Martin. Paul Wainer, 41, was briefly on that team, and the top reliever was milkman Jim Turner, 40, and about 10 seconds away from becoming one of the better pitching coaches in team history. The second baseman was great. He was Snuffy Sternweiss, who had one of his 2 consecutive 8-win seasons. His 1944 and 45 were very similar, and so I should just squish them together. Between the two, here come more numbers, but not Star Wars references. He hit .314, .387, .468, led the league both years in triples and stolen bases, and hits, and runs scored. He was a monster. And in peacetime, he hit .247, .351, .323. So you see how diluted things became. Now, all teams had guys who either hadn't left yet, like the Red Sox with Bobby Doerr or the Cardinals with Stan Musial, or had returned. But on the whole, you saw a token few that you were used to and a great many strangers. The Dodgers had this fantastic team right before the war. Bill James called it an almost perfect team. They won 100 games in both 1941 and 1942. But by 1944, with everyone gone, or almost everyone, they were losing 90 a year, with Howie Schultz at first base and a 16-year-old Tommy Brown, who just passed this year, rest in peace, at shortstop, and old racist outfielder Ben Chapman throwing knucklers out of the bullpen. And again, there were some familiar players, some of them pretty good. Augie Gallen and Dixie Walker, another racist outfielder, had good years. And there was old Paul Wainer, crossing a bridge or two from the Bronx that same year. It was the opposite order, actually. The Dodgers let him go, and he went to the Yankees. But what about those teams who didn't have a lot of depth before the war, who didn't have any stars to lose? They patched as best they could with 9 guys named Irv. It was this way. It had to be this way because our values demanded it. The democracies were threatened. Our democracy was threatened. And so we as a people went to war. Did everyone agree with that? No. But a majority of people did, or it wouldn't have happened. If the kind of purge that I've been hypothesizing about were to take place today, would it happen because the vast majority of us agreed with it and felt that the nation had to be purged of people named Guerrero and Soto? I don't think so. It would happen despite the majority, not because of it. And if that's the case, then what are we even doing here? To put it another way, talking you and I now, 80 years later, in retrospect, it seems inevitable that the United States would both go to war and fight on the side that we did choose and win. But none of that was automatic. None of it was certain. And if the majority of us were, for whatever reason, sympathetic to the Germans and Japanese and Italians, none of it would have worked the same way, including no Pearl Harbor, because whoever the president was at that time, they wouldn't have tried to rein in Japanese expansion in the Pacific. He or she would have just joined in with them. But we felt differently, and so it happened the way that it did. And I firmly believe we feel differently now, or I mean that our values are still aligned with those values. But the people in charge aren't acting that way, and a loud minority isn't acting that way, and so there's a disconnect in democracy. And I wish I knew how we plugged the thing back in again. In the meantime, enjoy Shohei Ohtani until you can't. Leapin' lizards, we made it to the end and the program only crashed 3 times. I think I need a computer doctor. Should you wish to doctor my social media, no, that doesn't really work, but we'll stay with it. Please follow me at Blue Sky, at StephenGoldman.bsky.social. You can also write us, by which I mean me, at infiniteinning@gmail.com, and there's a Facebook group. Simply go to Facebook, search on Infinite Inning, bang, you're there. I threw out a picture of Casey in his Oaks uniform. Why not? I like that stylized O. I have the cap and everything. Should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/The Infinite Inning. Gear of a rudimentary kind available at the-infinite-inning.creator-spring.com. Original soundtrack available at casualobservermusic.bandcamp.com. Finally, should you find yourself with the proverbial moment to spare, please go to the podcatcher of your choice and rate, review, and subscribe. It helps the show gain attention. And if your podcatcher doesn't let you do those things, you should still be sure to brush your teeth after every meal, but gently, oh so gently, those gums are delicate. Our theme song, which you are hearing now and have been listening to throughout the episode, was a co-composition of myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, who remembers that Daniel Webster once said, "Our country, our whole country, and nothing but our country." But you know, I've always appreciated my toast with a little jam on it. Well, if I can just figure out why whenever I'm looking for a blueberry muffin to go with Rick's toast, the only thing that's available is rhubarb pie, I'll be back next week with more tales from inside the Infinite Inning.